Have you ever dreamed of finding a hidden treasure? Imagine discovering an old map that could lead you to an island filled with gold. An island that no one has been able to find for years. But there is one problem. You are not the only person looking for that treasure. Dangerous men are following you. A mysterious ship is waiting at the harbor. And somewhere on the island, people are willing to betray their friends for a chest of gold. Welcome to Treasure Island, a thrilling adventure inspired by the classic story of Robert Louis Stevenson. In today's English lesson, you will follow the journey of a young man who leaves his quiet home and enters a world of ships, storms, pirates, secrets, and hidden treasure. But this is not just an adventure story. You will also improve your English naturally while listening to the story. So get comfortable, listen carefully, and let the story take you to a mysterious island where nothing is quite what it seems. Here is how today's lesson works. First, listen to the story. Try to understand the meaning from the situation. Don't worry if you don't understand every word. Second, read the passage. After the story, you will read a short section aloud and practice your pronunciation. Third, test your vocabulary. You will learn useful words from the story and test yourself to see how much you remember. So are you ready? A mysterious map is waiting. A dangerous journey is about to begin. And somewhere far across the sea, a forgotten treasure is waiting to be found. Let's begin our adventure. This is Treasure Island.
The sea had always been part of my life. I grew up in a small coastal village where fishing boats returned with the evening tide. Sailors stopped at the harbor, and the sound of waves against the shore was as familiar as the morning bells from the village church. Our family owned a modest inn a short distance from the water, and most days followed the same quiet routine. Travelers came and went, fishermen stopped for meals, and sailors sometimes stayed for a night or two before continuing their journeys. I had never imagined that anything extraordinary could happen in our little village. I certainly had no idea that one mysterious sailor would soon lead me into an adventure involving pirates, a hidden map, and a treasure buried somewhere far beyond the sea. It began on a cold afternoon near the end of autumn. Dark clouds were gathering above the water, and a sharp wind was making the old sign above our inn swing from side to side. I was outside helping my father secure some loose boards when I noticed a stranger walking slowly up the road from the harbor. He was a large, heavily built man with a weather-beaten face, a deep scar across one cheek, and clothes that looked as though they had spent more time at sea than on land. He carried a heavy wooden chest in both hands, but what caught my attention was not the chest. It was the way he kept looking behind him, as though he expected someone to appear on the road. Before reaching our door, he stopped and studied the harbor, then turned around and examined the road once more. Only after he seemed satisfied that nobody was following him did he enter the inn. He asked my father for a room, paid several coins in advance, and said that he might remain for some time. Yet he showed very little interest in the room itself. Instead, he began asking about the sailors who visited the inn, the ships currently anchored in the harbor, and whether any strangers had recently been asking questions about our village. Then he asked about a sailor with one leg. My father found the question strange, but the stranger seemed relieved when he learned that nobody matching that description had recently visited. He gave my father another coin and made it clear that, if such a man ever appeared, he wanted to know immediately. After that, he carried his chest upstairs and chose the room that gave him the clearest view of the sea. For several days, the old sailor became a strange but familiar presence in our inn. He spent long hours beside the window, watching the road and the harbor, and whenever a ship entered the bay, he seemed to study it carefully. He drank heavily in the evenings, but alcohol did not make him cheerful. Instead, it seemed to bring back memories that made him restless. If someone entered unexpectedly, his eyes immediately went to the door. Whenever footsteps sounded outside after dark, he stopped whatever he was doing and listened. I was young, and I probably should have stayed out of his business, but his behavior made me curious. Whenever he had been drinking for a while, he sometimes told stories about his years at sea. He described violent storms, distant islands, dangerous voyages, and ships that had vanished without a trace. He knew strange things about faraway places, and because I had never traveled farther than the neighboring towns, I could listen to him for hours. Yet whenever his stories turned toward pirates, his voice changed. He spoke more quietly, and something serious appeared in his expression. He described men who had spent years attacking ships and collecting enormous fortunes, and he claimed that some of them had hidden their gold on remote islands where nobody would ever think to look. Most people in the inn laughed when they heard such stories, treating them as the exaggerated tales of an old sailor. The sailor himself never laughed. Whenever someone joked about buried treasure, he simply stared into his drink with an expression that suggested he knew something the rest of us did not. One evening, while a storm was beating against the windows and the wind was making the roof tremble, the sailor began singing an old sea song. His voice was rough and low, and the strange melody gradually quieted everyone in the room. The song seemed to tell of a ship sailing toward a distant island, a fortune buried beneath the earth, and men who were willing to betray one another for gold. When the song ended, the sailor remained silent for several moments, staring into the fire. There was something in his expression that stayed with me long after he had returned to his room. For the first time, I seriously wondered whether the treasure in his stories was more than an old sailor's tale. A few days later, I found him sitting alone near the harbor while the morning sea was unusually calm. I sat nearby, and after some time he began speaking about the ocean and the dangers hidden beneath its peaceful surface. He explained that a sailor could look at a calm sea and believe himself completely safe, only to discover a few hours later that the same water had become strong enough to destroy his ship. The way he spoke made me feel that he was not really talking about the sea at all. He seemed to be describing the kind of danger that remains invisible until it is too late. Then, almost casually, he mentioned an island and gave it a name I had never heard before. Treasure Island. He explained that somewhere beyond the ordinary shipping routes was an island that was difficult to find and even harder to reach. According to his story, a legendary pirate had once taken an enormous fortune there and hidden it somewhere on the island. There were gold coins, silver, jewels, and enough wealth to change the life of anyone who discovered it. But the treasure had brought nothing but trouble to the men who knew about it. They had begun turning against one another, and several had died trying to protect or steal the secret. The sailor never explained exactly how he knew these things, but the more he spoke, the more certain I became that the story was connected to his own past. I wanted to know whether he had actually seen the treasure, but he avoided giving me a clear answer. Instead, he looked toward the distant horizon with an expression I could not understand. I suddenly felt that the island was not simply a story from his past. It was something he was still connected to. That night, I found myself thinking about Treasure Island long after everyone else had gone to sleep. I imagined a lonely island surrounded by dark water, thick forests hiding narrow paths, caves deep inside the cliffs, and somewhere beneath the earth, a chest filled with gold. But one question troubled me more than the treasure itself. If the sailor knew so much about the island, why was he hiding in our little inn, and who was he so afraid of? I did not have to wait long for the answer. Several weeks later, another stranger arrived at the inn. He was a thin man dressed in a dark coat, and there was something nervous about the way he moved as soon as he entered the building. He did not ask for food or a room. His first question was about the old sailor. When my father confirmed that the sailor was staying upstairs, the man's expression changed, and he immediately asked to see him. My father called up the stairs, but there was no answer. He called again, louder this time, yet the sailor remained silent. The stranger then began looking around the room, and eventually his eyes settled on the heavy wooden chest beside the staircase. He stared at it for several seconds before slowly walking toward it. Before he could reach the chest, however, the old sailor appeared at the top of the stairs. I had never seen him look so frightened. His face had suddenly lost its color, and his hand moved toward the knife at his side. The stranger stopped where he was, and for a moment the two men simply stared at one another. Neither explained their connection, but they clearly knew each other. The stranger eventually left, but the old sailor watched him until the door closed. Afterward, he insisted that the doors remain locked before sunset, and for the rest of the evening he kept checking the road outside. That night, I woke to footsteps in the hallway. The inn was dark, and rain was tapping against the windows while the wind moved through the old wooden walls. I opened my door slightly and saw the sailor standing beside the window with a pistol in his hand. He was listening carefully, as though he had heard something that I could not. Then 3 short whistles came from outside. The sailor immediately stepped away from the window. Whatever fear he had been hiding for weeks was now impossible to miss. He hurried into his room and opened the wooden chest, removing a small leather bag that he showed to my father and me. He warned us that dangerous men were searching for it and that, if it fell into their hands, the consequences could be terrible. Then he finally revealed why he had been so afraid. There was a map. Not an ordinary map, but a map that could lead to the island he had told me about, and perhaps to the treasure buried there. He explained that the secret had already cost several men their lives, and he feared that more blood would be spilled if the map was discovered. He seemed ready to tell us everything, but before he could continue, his strength suddenly failed and he collapsed. My father and I carried him to his bed and stayed beside him throughout the night, hoping that he would recover. As the first light of morning entered the room, it became clear that the old sailor was dying. He tried to warn us once more about the people searching for him, but his voice was too weak to understand clearly. The only words that reached us were connected to the one-legged sailor he had feared from the beginning. Then his eyes closed. The old sailor was dead. For a while, our inn seemed strangely quiet. Outside, the village continued its ordinary morning routine. Fishermen prepared their boats, travelers walked toward the harbor, and the sea looked peaceful beneath the early sunlight. Yet inside our house, everything had changed. We now knew that the old sailor had been hiding something valuable, and we also knew that someone else was searching for it. My father gave me the key to the sailor's room and asked me to help search his belongings before the authorities arrived. I climbed the stairs slowly, carrying the key in my hand, and stopped outside the room where the old sailor had spent so many uneasy nights. I unlocked the door, and it opened with a long, quiet creak. Everything inside looked exactly as he had left it. His coat hung beside the bed, his boots stood near the window, and an empty bottle remained on the table. But beside the bed was the heavy wooden chest, the same chest that had caught the stranger's attention days earlier. I stood there staring at it. The sailor had protected that chest as though his life depended on it, and now he was dead. Whatever was inside must have been important. I reached toward the lock, remembering his warnings about the map and the men searching for it. Then I heard footsteps downstairs. I froze. Someone had entered the inn. The footsteps moved slowly across the floor, and then they stopped. A moment later, I heard the front door being locked from the inside. I looked at the chest again, and for the first time I understood what the old sailor had been trying to tell us. The treasure was no longer just a story. Someone had come looking for the map, and whoever it was, they were already inside our house. For a few seconds, I could not move. I stood beside the old sailor's chest, listening to the footsteps below, while the thought of someone searching our inn made my hands feel cold. My father was still downstairs, unaware of what I had heard, and I knew that whoever had entered was unlikely to be an ordinary traveler. The old sailor had spent weeks fearing the men who were looking for him, and now, only hours after his death, one of them had found us. I quietly closed the chest and slipped the key into my pocket. Then I moved toward the door and listened again. The footsteps had disappeared, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I could hear the faint sound of the wind outside and the creaking of the old wooden floor beneath my father's footsteps downstairs. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw a figure standing near the entrance. It was the same thin stranger who had visited the inn before, but he was no longer alone. Two other men stood behind him, both dressed like sailors, and neither looked particularly friendly. My father was facing them, trying to understand what they wanted, while the strangers were looking around the room as if they already knew exactly what they had come to find. The thin man noticed me on the stairs, and his eyes immediately moved toward my pocket. I knew then that he suspected I had the key. My father tried to keep the men talking while I slowly stepped away from the stairs. The old sailor had warned us that dangerous people were searching for something, and suddenly I understood that the warning had not been exaggerated. These men were not interested in the dead sailor, his clothes, or his money. They wanted what he had hidden. The thin man began asking questions about the sailor's belongings, and my father explained that we had not yet searched the room. The answer seemed to make the visitors impatient. One of the sailors moved toward the staircase, but before he could climb it, we heard voices outside. Several villagers were approaching the inn. The strangers immediately became nervous. They had expected to find us alone. After a brief exchange between them, the three men left through the back door. I watched from the window as they disappeared toward the harbor, and I could not shake the feeling that they would return. They had failed to find what they wanted, but they now knew that the search would have to continue. My father locked the doors, and we finally returned to the sailor's room. This time we opened the chest. Inside were clothes, old papers, a compass, several weapons, and a few personal belongings that appeared to have little value. Beneath these things, however, we discovered the leather bag the sailor had shown us the night before. My father opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper. At first, it looked like an ordinary map, but when we spread it across the table, we realized that it was something far more important. It showed an island surrounded by open water, with several hills marked across its center and a strange symbol drawn near one of the shores. There were notes written in faded ink along the edges. Some described a bay where a ship could anchor safely. Others marked a hill, a stream, and several places that seemed to have been chosen for reasons we could not understand. Near the center of the island was a large red mark, and beside it were three words that made my heart beat faster. Treasure buried here. My father stared at the map in silence. Until that moment, we had still been able to convince ourselves that the old sailor's stories were nothing more than memories from a dangerous life. Now we were looking at proof that the island existed, and perhaps proof that the treasure existed too. But the map contained something else. A name. It belonged to a famous pirate whose reputation had frightened sailors for generations. According to the notes, this pirate had gathered a fortune through years of robbery before disappearing from the sea. Nobody knew exactly where he had gone, and many believed that his treasure had never been found. Now we understood why the old sailor had been so frightened. Someone else knew about the map. Someone who was willing to kill for it. My father believed we needed help, and the first person who came to mind was a respected doctor and landowner who lived nearby. He was known for his intelligence and courage, and more importantly, he had enough influence to protect us if the men returned. We carefully folded the map and hid it beneath my coat. Then we left the inn. The walk to the doctor's house felt completely different from the walks I had taken many times before. Every stranger on the road made me nervous. Every sound behind us made me turn around. The village looked the same as it always had, but I could no longer see it in the same way. We were carrying a secret, and somewhere behind us, men were looking for it. When we reached the doctor's house, we were taken into a private room where he listened carefully as my father explained everything that had happened. At first, the doctor seemed skeptical, but when he saw the map, his expression changed. He recognized the name written across it. He had heard stories about the pirate and the enormous fortune he was believed to have hidden before his death. He also knew that several former members of the pirate's crew had spent years searching for the treasure. The doctor understood the danger immediately. He advised us not to tell anyone about the map. But there was another problem. If we stayed in the village, the men would eventually find us. The doctor believed that the safest choice was to leave before they had time to organize themselves. He knew of a wealthy gentleman who had always dreamed of making a long sea voyage, and he believed that this man might be willing to finance an expedition to the island. At first, the idea seemed impossible. Only a short time earlier, my greatest concern had been helping my family run the inn. Now we were discussing a journey across the ocean in search of pirate treasure. Yet the map lay on the table between us. It made the impossible seem real. Within a few days, preparations began. A ship was found, supplies were purchased, and a crew was assembled. The wealthy gentleman who agreed to finance the voyage was enthusiastic about the adventure and seemed genuinely excited by the possibility of discovering the treasure. I was excited too, but the doctor remained cautious. He reminded us that the map was valuable not because of the paper itself, but because of the secret it contained. If the wrong person discovered our destination, the voyage could become extremely dangerous. As preparations continued, I began to realize how much my life had changed. The quiet inn where I had grown up was behind me, and ahead lay a long journey across an ocean I had never traveled. I had dreamed about adventure. Now adventure was waiting for me. The ship was called the Hispaniola. When I first saw her standing in the harbor, I could hardly believe that I would soon be sailing aboard her. She was a strong, beautiful vessel with tall masts and broad sails, and from the deck I could see the village shrinking behind us as we prepared to leave. The crew seemed friendly enough, and many of the sailors had years of experience at sea. One man in particular quickly became popular with everyone. His name was Long John Silver. He had only one leg. The moment I heard his name, I remembered the old sailor. For a second, a strange fear passed through me. The sailor at the inn had spent his final weeks terrified of a one-legged man, and now, standing aboard our ship, I was looking at one. But Long John Silver did not seem frightening. He was cheerful, intelligent, and remarkably good with people. He worked as the ship's cook and moved around the deck with surprising ease, using a wooden crutch to support himself. He spoke warmly to the crew, joked with the sailors, and seemed to know exactly how to make people trust him. I found myself liking him almost immediately. Perhaps that was my first mistake. The voyage began under clear skies, and for several days everything went smoothly. The wind was favorable, the crew worked efficiently, and the ship moved steadily toward the distant island shown on the map. Each day, I spent more time on deck. I watched the coastline disappear behind us and listened to the sailors tell stories about the sea. At night, I looked at the stars and wondered what we would find when we reached the island. The treasure seemed closer with every passing day. But there were small things I began to notice. Sometimes, when the officers were nearby, the sailors became unusually quiet. At other times, groups of men gathered together in corners of the ship and stopped talking whenever someone approached. I could not explain what was wrong, but the atmosphere had changed. One evening, I was hiding inside an empty barrel near the kitchen when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I had climbed into the barrel looking for apples. I had no intention of listening to anyone, but before I could climb out, I heard voices approaching. One voice belonged to Long John Silver. The other voices belonged to several sailors. They were speaking quietly, but I could hear enough to understand the truth. The crew was planning a mutiny. They had not joined the voyage because they wanted to help us find the treasure. They wanted the treasure for themselves. The plan was to wait until we reached the island, allow the map to lead us to the fortune, and then take control of the ship. Anyone who resisted would be killed or abandoned. I remained inside the barrel, hardly daring to breathe. Then I heard something that frightened me even more. Long John Silver was not merely aware of the plan. He was leading it. The man I had trusted, the friendly one-legged sailor who had made everyone laugh during the voyage, was secretly organizing the mutiny. For the first time, I understood why the old sailor had been so afraid. The one-legged man had finally found us, and we were sailing directly toward his treasure. I remained hidden inside the barrel, barely breathing as the voices continued around me. Long John Silver spoke calmly, explaining that patience was more important than strength, and that the crew must wait until the right moment before revealing their plans. The men around him seemed completely loyal, and from the confidence in their voices, it was clear that the mutiny had been planned long before our ship ever left the harbor. I knew I had to get away before anyone discovered me. When the men finally moved toward the other side of the deck, I waited several moments before climbing out. My legs were shaking, and my mind was racing as I hurried toward a quiet corner of the ship. I had never felt so frightened. The treasure that had seemed exciting only days earlier now appeared to be the reason we were all in danger. I immediately searched for the doctor and the gentleman who had financed the voyage. They were still unaware of the cruise plans, and when I finally managed to tell them what I had heard, their expressions became serious. They had already suspected that something was wrong, but they had not realized how many men were involved or how carefully the mutiny had been organized. There was very little time to decide what to do. The ship was already approaching the island. We could not simply turn around. The crew would have noticed, and the men supporting Silver were too numerous to confront openly. Our only hope was to remain calm, pretend that nothing had happened, and wait for an opportunity to protect ourselves. So we continued toward the island. The next morning, the land appeared on the horizon. At first, it looked like a dark shape floating above the water. As we drew closer, the outline became clearer. Tall hills rose behind thick forests, and rocky cliffs surrounded parts of the coastline. A mist hung over the higher ground, making the island seem mysterious and almost unreal. I understood immediately why sailors had told frightening stories about places like this. There was something unsettling about the island. It looked beautiful from a distance, but it also looked as though it were hiding something. The captain brought the ship toward a sheltered bay marked on the map, while the crew prepared to lower the boats. Everyone appeared excited about finally reaching land, but beneath that excitement was a tension that could be felt throughout the ship. Silver and his men were waiting. They wanted the treasure, and now they knew exactly where to look. We decided to allow most of the crew to go ashore while keeping a small group aboard the ship. The plan was simple. We would remain cautious, observe the men, and prevent them from taking complete control. But plans rarely survive contact with danger. Once the boats reached the shore, the sailors quickly disappeared among the trees. Silver moved easily across the beach despite his wooden leg, directing the men and keeping them together. From the ship, he looked like the same cheerful cook everyone trusted. I knew better now. I could not stop watching him. A strange feeling came over me as I looked toward the forest. The map showed the treasure somewhere inland, but the island was much larger than I had imagined. There were hills, streams, thick woods, and areas that were almost impossible to see from the coast. Somewhere in that wilderness was a fortune, and somewhere in that same wilderness were men who were prepared to kill for it. I eventually found an opportunity to go ashore myself. I had no real plan. I simply wanted to see the island and understand what kind of place we had entered. The moment I stepped into the forest, I realized how different it was from anything I had ever known. The trees grew close together, blocking much of the sunlight. Strange plants covered the ground, and insects moved through the thick leaves. Every few steps, I heard something moving nearby, but I could never tell whether it was an animal or a person. I walked deeper into the forest. For the first time since leaving home, I was completely alone. Then I heard a sound behind me. I turned quickly. Nothing. I waited, listening carefully. A branch moved somewhere in the trees. I began walking again, but now I was much more cautious. I had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was following me, although I could not see anyone. Then I heard a human voice. Came from somewhere ahead. I moved carefully through the trees until I saw a man sitting beside a fallen tree. His clothes were torn, his hair was long and dirty, and his face looked thin from hunger. For a moment, I thought he might be one of Silver's men. Then he raised his head. He was not part of the crew. He was a man who had been living alone on the island for years. His name was Ben Gunn. He told me that he had once sailed with pirates who had come to the island searching for the treasure. He had been left behind after a disagreement with the crew, and he had survived alone ever since. At first, I did not know whether I could trust him. After everything I had learned about the crew, trusting a stranger seemed dangerous. But there was something about his appearance that made me believe he had suffered enough to have little reason to deceive me. He told me that he knew about the treasure, More importantly, he knew something about the map. The information made my heart race, but I tried not to show how much it interested me. Ben Gunn explained that the pirates had searched the island for a long time, digging in several places and following clues that eventually led them nowhere. The treasure had already been moved. The map was no longer the complete answer. Someone had changed the situation years before we arrived. I wanted to know who had moved it, but Ben Gunn became strangely cautious. He explained that there were secrets on the island that were safer left unexplained, and he promised that if we helped him escape, he might be able to help us in return. Before we could continue, we heard voices in the distance. Silver's men were nearby. Ben Gunn immediately disappeared into the trees, moving with surprising speed. I followed another path back toward the shore, hoping to reach our group before anyone noticed that I had been away. But the island had already begun to divide us. Some of our men were still loyal to the captain. Others had joined Silver. Nobody knew exactly who could be trusted, and every conversation seemed to carry a hidden meaning. When I returned to the beach, I saw that the situation had become much worse. The mutineers had taken control of several boats, and the captain's men were retreating toward an old wooden structure that appeared on the map. It was a small fort surrounded by trees and earthworks, probably built years earlier by sailors who had used the island as a temporary base. The fort gave us protection, but it could not protect us forever. We managed to reach it before Silver's men could stop us. Once inside, the captain and the others began preparing for an attack. Supplies were gathered, weapons were checked, and every entrance was watched carefully. For the first time, the treasure became almost irrelevant. Survival was now the only thing that mattered. That night, the island was strangely quiet. I sat inside the fort listening to the wind moving through the trees. Somewhere beyond the walls, Silver and his men were waiting. We did not know exactly how many of them remained loyal to him, and we did not know when they would attack. The darkness made every sound seem closer. A branch breaking in the forest sounded like a man's footsteps. A bird calling in the distance made everyone reach for a weapon. Even the wind seemed threatening. Then, just before dawn, we heard movement outside the fort. The attack had begun. The first shots came suddenly, breaking the silence and echoing through the trees. Men rushed to the walls as bullets struck the wooden defenses. Smoke filled the air, and the peaceful island we had admired from the ship became a battlefield. The captain's men fought desperately. The mutineers attacked from several directions, trying to force their way through the entrance. For a while, it seemed that they might succeed, but our small group managed to hold them back. Then came a moment that changed the battle. One of the attackers reached the wall and climbed over. He landed inside the fort. Before anyone could stop him, he raised his weapon. I saw him clearly. He was one of Silver's men. And behind him, moving through the smoke with his wooden crutch and a pistol in his hand, came Long John Silver himself. The friendly cook who had laughed with us on the ship was gone. In his place stood the leader of the mutiny. He had finally shown us who he really was. The battle continued until the attackers were forced to retreat. When the smoke began to clear, the fort was still ours, but several men were wounded, and our supplies were running low. We had survived the first attack, but it was obvious that Silver would not stop. Later that evening, the captain examined the map again. He studied the markings carefully, then compared them with the island outside. The treasure was supposedly nearby, but the map contained several details that no longer made sense. One hill was marked incorrectly. A path had disappeared beneath the forest, and the place where the treasure was supposed to be buried seemed strangely exposed. The captain began to suspect that the map had been altered or that the island itself had changed since it was drawn. He remembered Ben Gunn. He had said that the treasure was no longer where the pirates expected it to be. Perhaps he knew more than he had told me. That thought stayed with me as darkness fell. Then, sometime during the night, we heard a strange sound outside the fort. It was not a gunshot. It was not a voice. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. Everyone inside the fort became silent. The sound stopped. Then it began again, closer this time. We moved toward the entrance and listened. Something was coming through the trees. Whatever it was moving slowly. And as we waited in the darkness, I began to wonder whether the greatest danger on Treasure Island was really the pirates, or something else that had been waiting on the island long before we arrived. The sound outside the fort continued for several minutes, but whatever was moving through the trees never came close enough for us to see it clearly. Eventually, the noise disappeared into the darkness, leaving us with an uneasy silence. Nobody slept much that night. We had already learned that the island could be dangerous, but now it seemed that even the things we could not see might be a threat. By morning, the situation inside the fort had become desperate. Our supplies were running low, several men were wounded, and we knew that Silver's group was still somewhere in the forest. The captain believed that another attack was only a matter of time, but there was also a more serious problem. We had no idea where the treasure was, and the map that had brought us to the island was no longer enough to find it. I could not stop thinking about Ben Gunn. He had disappeared into the forest before Silver's men could find him, and I believed he might be our best chance of understanding what was really happening on the island. I decided to search for him, even though leaving the fort alone was dangerous. I waited until the others were occupied, then slipped through a small opening in the trees and began moving carefully toward the place where I had met him. The forest seemed even darker than before. Sunlight reached the ground only in narrow patches, and every movement in the bushes made me wonder whether Silver's men were nearby. I kept looking over my shoulder, but after some time I began to realize that I was not being followed. Then I heard a familiar voice. Ben Gunn stepped out from behind a group of trees. He looked nervous, but he seemed pleased to see me. He explained that he had been watching the pirates and knew that Silver was becoming impatient. The mutineers were beginning to argue among themselves because they had expected to find the treasure quickly, and their failure was making them suspicious of one another. Ben Gunn then revealed something that changed the entire situation. He had not been living on the island simply by surviving on whatever food he could find. During his years there, he had explored almost every part of the island, and he had discovered places that even the pirates did not know about. More importantly, he had found the treasure. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Ben Gunn explained that the famous pirate had buried the fortune years earlier, but the treasure had later been discovered by someone else. Instead of leaving it where it was, Ben Gunn had secretly moved it to a different location. He had done this long before our ship arrived, knowing that anyone following the old map would search in the wrong place. The treasure was no longer beneath the red mark shown on the map. It was somewhere else. I wanted to know exactly where, but Ben Gunn would not tell me yet. He had a reason for keeping the secret. He had seen what greed could do to men, and he believed that if the pirates discovered the treasure before we could leave the island, they would kill everyone who stood between them and the gold. He promised that there was a way to recover it safely, but first we had to survive. When I returned to the fort, I found the others preparing for another attack. Silver had sent a message demanding that we surrender the map, promising that anyone who resisted would be killed. The captain refused, but the message made one thing clear. Silver knew we still had the map. He also knew that we were running out of options. That afternoon, we saw several men moving through the trees. They were carrying a white flag, and after some discussion, we allowed them to approach. Long John Silver came forward alone, leaning on his wooden crutch and wearing the same calm expression he had shown us aboard the ship. It was strange to see him standing there as though nothing had happened. He spoke politely and tried to convince us that the mutiny had become unavoidable. He claimed that the crew had lost confidence in the captain and that he was now trying to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. But we knew what he really wanted. The map. Silver offered us protection in exchange for it. The captain refused. Silver's expression changed only slightly, but I could see the anger behind his eyes. He left without another word, and we knew that the next meeting would not be so peaceful. That evening, something unexpected happened. The captain was captured. It happened so quickly that none of us could understand how Silver's men had managed to get close enough. One moment the captain was inside the fort, and the next we heard shouting from outside. By the time we reached the entrance, Silver's men had already taken him. We were certain that Silver would kill him. Instead, he sent another message. He wanted the map, and he wanted it immediately. The doctor warned us that giving Silver the map would not save the captain. Once Silver had what he wanted, there would be no reason for him to keep his promise. But we had another problem. The captain's life was in danger. I felt responsible because I was the one who had first discovered the mutiny. I had brought the warning to the others, but now the entire expedition seemed to be falling apart. Then I remembered Ben Gunn. If he truly knew where the treasure was, perhaps the map was no longer our greatest weapon. We decided to take a chance. That night, we left the fort quietly and made our way through the forest. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the darkness made the journey difficult. We followed the path Ben Gunn had described, keeping low whenever we heard voices. Eventually, we reached a rocky hillside. Ben Gunn was waiting there. He led us through a narrow passage between the rocks and into a hidden cave. Inside, there were signs that someone had been living there for a long time. There were tools, old pieces of clothing, and wooden containers filled with food. But that was not what caught my attention. Ben Gunn pointed toward the back of the cave. There, partly covered by a large cloth, was a wooden chest. My heart began to race. The treasure was real. For years, sailors had searched for it. Men had fought and died because of it. The old sailor had spent his final days terrified that someone would discover the map. And now the fortune was sitting in front of us. We opened the chest. Gold coins filled the lower part, shining even in the dim light of the cave. There were silver pieces, jewels, and objects that had clearly come from different countries. It was impossible to know how much the treasure was worth, but it was obvious that it was a fortune beyond anything I had ever imagined. Yet instead of feeling happy, I felt strangely uneasy. The treasure had caused too much suffering. Men had crossed oceans for it, betrayed friends for it, and killed one another because of it. Now we understood why. We quickly began moving the treasure into bags so that it could be carried back to the ship. Ben Gunn explained that he had already moved much of it over time, but there was still more than enough to make the journey worthwhile. Then we heard something outside the cave. Voices. Someone was approaching. We immediately extinguished the light and remained completely silent. The voices grew closer. It was Silver. He was speaking to his men, and they were discussing the treasure. Somehow, they had discovered that the map was no longer useful and had begun searching for another clue. We waited until their voices faded into the distance. Only then did we breathe again, but the danger was increasing. Silver had become desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable. We returned toward the fort with part of the treasure, but when we reached the area where it had stood, we discovered that the pirates had taken control of it. The captain and several loyal men were being held prisoner. Silver had won, or so he believed. He had the fort, he had the prisoners, and he thought the treasure was still waiting somewhere on the island. He did not know that we had already found it. We decided to let him believe exactly that. The next morning, Silver gathered his men and forced us to lead them toward the place marked on the map. We followed the old markings through the forest, pretending that we were still searching for the treasure. Silver was becoming more impatient with every step. The men searched beneath trees, beside rocks, and around the hills marked on the map. Eventually, we reached the exact location where the treasure was supposed to be buried. Silver ordered his men to dig. They began tearing apart the ground. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. The hole became deeper, but there was no sign of gold. The mood among the pirates changed quickly. They began accusing one another of hiding information. Silver looked at the empty ground and understood that something was wrong. Then one of the men noticed a small wooden marker nearby. It was old, partly covered with moss, and almost impossible to see unless someone knew where to look. Silver walked toward it. He examined the marker carefully. Then he looked at the map. For the first time, fear appeared on his face. The treasure was not where the map said it should be. Someone had moved it, and whoever had moved it had known exactly what the pirates would do. Suddenly, the forest erupted with gunfire. The pirates scattered in panic. Men who had been searching for treasure only moments earlier were now running for their lives. Some dropped their weapons, while others disappeared among the trees. Silver remained frozen for a moment, trying to understand where the attack was coming from. Then he realized the truth. They had been tricked. The treasure was already gone, and the people who had taken it were watching them from somewhere nearby. As the gunfire continued, I caught sight of a figure moving between the trees. It was Ben Gunn. He gave me a quick signal and disappeared again. I finally understood his plan. The treasure had been moved long before we arrived, and the old map had been left behind to mislead anyone who came searching for it. But the greatest surprise was still waiting for us. The pirates had believed that the treasure was their only prize. They were wrong, because while they had been following the map, we had already found the real fortune, and now we only needed to escape the island alive. The pirates scattered through the forest after the gunfire, but their confusion did not last long. Long John Silver was too experienced to panic for very long, and although he had lost control of his men, he still understood that the treasure was somewhere nearby. I could see the calculation in his eyes as he watched the forest, trying to discover who had deceived him and where the fortune had really gone. We had little time to enjoy our advantage. The captain and the other prisoners were still being held at the fort, and we knew that Silver might use them as a way to force us into the open. The treasure was now safely hidden, but that meant very little if we could not reach the ship and escape the island. Ben Gunn knew another route through the forest, one that avoided the main paths used by the pirates. He led us along a narrow trail between the trees, moving quickly whenever the ground allowed it. We carried only a small portion of the treasure because taking everything would have slowed us down, and our greatest priority was getting the prisoners back. As we approached the fort, we could hear voices from inside. Silver's men were arguing. The discovery that the treasure was missing had destroyed whatever trust remained among them. Some blamed Silver for bringing them to the island, while others believed that someone in the crew had secretly stolen the fortune. The fear and greed that had held them together were now turning them against one another. We waited until darkness returned before moving closer. The fort was surrounded by a rough wooden wall, and several men stood outside guarding the entrance. We watched them for a long time, looking for a weakness. Then Ben Gunn pointed toward a small opening on the far side of the fort. He knew a way inside. We crawled through the trees and reached the opening without being seen. Once inside, we discovered that the guards had become careless because they believed the prisoners were completely under their control. The captain was still alive. So were the others. They were exhausted and hungry, but when they saw us, their expressions changed immediately. We quickly explained that the treasure had been found and that the pirates no longer had control of the situation. The captain did not celebrate. Instead, he warned us that Silver was more dangerous now than he had been before. He was right. We had barely finished speaking when a shot sounded outside the fort. Everyone froze. Another shot followed. Then another. Silver's remaining men had discovered that something was wrong. We prepared for another fight, but before the pirates could reach the entrance, a voice called from outside. It was Silver. He wanted to speak. The captain agreed, but only after making sure the doors were secured. Silver entered alone, carrying his crutch and looking much older than he had when we first met him aboard the Hispaniola. For the first time, he appeared tired. He explained that most of his men had abandoned him. They had taken weapons and disappeared into the forest, leaving him with only a few loyal followers. He also admitted that the treasure was no longer in the place shown on the map. But Silver had one more piece of information. He knew that we had found it. The captain asked how he knew, and Silver explained that one of his men had seen Ben Gunn carrying supplies toward the hidden cave. The secret was no longer safe. Silver wanted protection. In exchange, he was willing to help us reach the ship. It was a dangerous bargain, but the captain understood that we needed every advantage we could get. Silver knew the island better than most of the crew, and he also knew where the remaining pirates were hiding. So, reluctantly, we allowed him to stay with us. I could not trust him. Every time he spoke, I wondered what he was hiding. Yet Silver behaved differently now. Without his crew around him, the confident pirate leader seemed to have disappeared. He became quiet and careful, watching everyone and choosing his words wisely. It was difficult to tell whether he was truly helping us or simply waiting for another opportunity to save himself. The journey back to the ship took longer than expected. The forest was difficult to cross, and several times we heard distant voices. We moved slowly, avoiding the paths where the remaining pirates might be waiting. The treasure was divided among several men, so that no single person had to carry too much. As we approached the coast, the sound of the sea became clearer. For the first time in days, I felt hope. The Hispaniola was still waiting in the bay. But when we reached the shoreline, we discovered that the ship was not where we had left her. She was gone. For a moment, nobody spoke. The ship had been our only way home. Without her, the treasure meant nothing. The captain immediately began searching the beach for clues. There were footprints in the sand, marks where a boat had been pulled into the water, and several broken pieces of rope near the rocks. Someone had taken the ship. We feared the worst. Then Ben Gunn noticed something in the distance. A small boat was moving across the bay. It was heading toward us. As it came closer, we recognized one of our loyal sailors at the oars. He had managed to retake the ship with the help of another crew member and had returned to find us. Relief spread through the group, but the joy did not last long. The sailor brought terrible news. Several pirates had escaped from the island, and one of them had tried to reach the ship before they could take control of it. The crew had fought them off, but the ship had suffered damage and would need repairs before we could sail. We were still trapped. That night, we returned to the fort. Silver remained strangely quiet throughout the evening. He seemed exhausted, and for a while I almost felt sorry for him. He had been a pirate, a liar, and the leader of a mutiny, but now he was surrounded by people who wanted to see him punished. I wondered what kind of man he really was. Perhaps he had once been different. Perhaps the sea had changed him. Or perhaps he had always been exactly what he appeared to be. The next morning, the captain announced that we would repair the ship and leave as soon as possible. There was enough food to survive several more days, but staying longer would be dangerous. The remaining pirates were still somewhere on the island. We began working immediately. Wood was gathered, ropes were repaired, and the damaged parts of the ship were examined. Everyone was exhausted, but the thought of going home gave us strength. During the repairs, I noticed that Silver was missing. At first, nobody seemed concerned. Then we discovered that one of the boats was also gone. Silver had escaped. He had taken a small amount of treasure with him. The captain was furious, but there was nothing we could do. Silver had once again chosen the moment that gave him the best chance of survival. Oddly enough, I was not surprised. We completed the repairs and loaded the remaining treasure aboard the ship. Before leaving, we searched the island one final time for anyone who might still be alive. We found 2 of the remaining pirates. They were frightened, exhausted, and completely broken by what had happened. They begged to be taken with us, but the captain refused. The island had become a place of betrayal and death, and he believed that leaving them there was safer than bringing them aboard. As the ship finally moved away from the shore, I stood on the deck and watched Treasure Island disappear into the distance. The hills became smaller. The forests faded into a dark line. Soon there was nothing left but open sea. I should have felt nothing but happiness. We had survived. We had found the treasure. We were going home. Yet I could not forget the people who had died there, or the fear that had followed us from the moment the old sailor first entered our inn. The treasure had brought us wealth, but it had also brought danger, betrayal, and death. As the island disappeared beyond the horizon, I began to understand something the old sailor had known all along. Gold could change a man's life, but it could also change the man himself. For several days, the voyage home was peaceful. The sea remained calm, the crew worked quietly, and the treasure was kept under careful watch. Slowly, the fear that had followed us began to fade. Then, one evening, we discovered that something was missing. A portion of the treasure had disappeared. The captain immediately ordered everyone on deck. Every sailor was searched. Nothing was found. The missing treasure was not enough to ruin us, but there was only one person who could have taken it. Long John Silver. We realized that he must have stolen it before escaping the island. For some reason, the discovery did not make me angry. Instead, I found myself thinking about him and wondering where he might be now. Perhaps he had found another ship. Perhaps he had returned to the sea. Perhaps he was already planning his next adventure. Nobody knew. And perhaps that was exactly how Long John Silver wanted it. The journey continued, and eventually the outline of our homeland appeared on the horizon. After everything we had endured, the sight of land seemed almost unreal. We had left as travelers searching for treasure. We were returning as survivors. And although the fortune we carried would change our lives forever, I knew that I would never again look at the sea in quite the same way. Because somewhere beyond that horizon was an island where a forgotten pirate had buried his fortune, and where I had learned that the greatest treasure was not gold at all. It was the chance to return home alive. The sight of land should have brought complete relief, yet as our ship moved steadily toward home, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened since the day the old sailor first walked into our inn. It seemed impossible that so much could have changed in such a short time. I had left home as an ordinary boy who knew almost nothing about the world beyond our village, and now I was returning with stories of pirates, hidden treasure, betrayal, and an island that I knew I would never forget. The crew was quieter than before. Everyone had survived the journey, but the experience had changed us. The men who remained on the ship rarely spoke about the pirates or the treasure unless it was necessary. Even the sound of gold coins moving inside the locked containers seemed to remind us of everything that had happened. The captain kept the treasure under constant watch. He knew that danger did not always disappear simply because the island was behind us. There had already been too much betrayal, and he trusted very few people completely. The doctor agreed with him, while the gentleman who had financed the expedition seemed more interested in counting the fortune than worrying about the past. As for me, I often stood alone near the side of the ship, watching the waves and wondering where Long John Silver had gone. He had escaped with a small portion of the treasure, and nobody knew where he was. The captain believed he would eventually return to the sea, perhaps joining another crew under another name. The doctor thought Silver was too clever to allow himself to be caught easily. I suspected they were both right. Silver had always seemed to understand people better than they understood him. He knew when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to disappear. Even after everything he had done, I could not completely forget the friendly cook I had first met aboard the Hispaniola. Perhaps that was what made him so dangerous. He could make people trust him. The days passed peacefully, and slowly the tension aboard the ship began to disappear. We were eating regularly again, sleeping without weapons beside our beds, and talking about home. Some of the sailors had plans for what they would do with their share of the money, while others simply wanted to return to their families. I began thinking about our inn. I wondered whether the village would look smaller when I returned. I wondered whether the old room where the sailor had stayed would still feel frightening, or whether it would simply become another room in our house. Most of all, I wondered what my life would be like after Treasure Island. The answer came sooner than I expected. One morning, the captain called me to the deck. The coastline of our homeland was clearly visible now, and several small boats were moving across the water. The harbor was not far away. After months of uncertainty, we were finally almost home. I could hardly believe it. The same sea that had once seemed endless now felt like a road leading us back to safety. When we finally entered the harbor, people gathered along the shore to watch the ship arrive. The sight made me realize how much I had missed ordinary life. The voices of the villagers, the familiar buildings, the smell of the land. Everything seemed more precious than I remembered. We unloaded the treasure carefully. The fortune was divided according to the agreements made before the voyage, and although everyone received enough to change their lives, the doctor reminded us that money could not bring back those who had died. He was right. There were names we would never forget. Some had been killed during the mutiny. Others had disappeared on the island. A few had simply been left behind. Treasure Island had taken something from every person who had entered its forests. Even those who returned were not quite the same. My father was waiting when I reached the inn. The moment I saw him, every memory of the journey seemed to disappear. For a while, I was no longer thinking about pirates or treasure. I was simply home. We spent that evening talking about everything that had happened, although there were parts of the story that were difficult to explain. My father wanted to know about the island, the ship, and the treasure, but more than anything, he wanted to know whether I had been afraid. I told him the truth. Yes, I had been afraid. There had been moments when I was certain I would never see home again. But there had also been moments when fear had taught me to think carefully, to trust my instincts, and to understand that courage did not mean feeling no fear. It meant continuing even when fear was telling you to stop. In the weeks that followed, our lives slowly returned to normal. The inn became busy again. Travelers came through the doors, and fishermen once more filled the harbor with their voices. Sometimes, when I looked toward the sea, I could almost imagine that the entire adventure had been a dream. But then I would remember the old sailor. I would remember the heavy chest, the mysterious map, the one-legged man, and the island. Those memories never disappeared. The treasure itself was kept in a secure place, and eventually most of it was divided among the people who had survived the expedition. I received a share as well, more money than I had ever imagined possessing. At first, I thought the fortune would make me completely happy. But I soon discovered that money could not erase memories. There were nights when I dreamed about the island. Sometimes I saw the dark forest again. Sometimes I heard gunshots in the distance. And sometimes I saw the old sailor standing beside the window of our inn, staring toward the sea as though he could already see the danger coming. I often wondered whether he had known how the story would end. Perhaps he had. Perhaps he had understood that treasure was never simply treasure. It was a test. It revealed what people were willing to do when they believed wealth was within their reach. Some men became greedy. Some became cruel. Some betrayed their friends. And a few managed to remain loyal even when loyalty was dangerous. The doctor once told me that the greatest lesson of the voyage was not about treasure at all. He believed that the island had shown us what people could become when they allowed greed to control their decisions. I understood what he meant. Before the voyage, I had imagined treasure as something wonderful. I had thought about gold coins, jewels, and a fortune that could solve every problem. After the voyage, I saw things differently. The treasure was valuable, but the journey had taught me something more important. I had learned to be careful about whom I trusted. I had learned that appearances could be misleading, and I had learned that a person's true character often became visible only when there was something important to gain. One afternoon, several months after our return, I was standing near the harbor when I saw an unfamiliar ship entering the bay. For a moment, my heart began beating faster. The ship moved slowly across the water, its sails catching the afternoon wind. I watched it carefully. Then I realized that I was looking for one particular figure, a man with a wooden crutch. I almost laughed at myself. Of course, it was impossible. There was no reason to believe Silver was aboard that ship, and even if he were, he would have no reason to return to our village. Still, I watched until the ship disappeared behind the harbor buildings. That was the last time I ever saw a ship and did not wonder where it had come from. Years passed. The story of the treasure became something people in the village sometimes asked me about. Travelers who heard rumors would want to know whether the island really existed. whether the treasure had truly been found, and whether Long John Silver was still alive. I never knew what to tell them. The island had been real, the treasure had been real, and Silver had escaped. Beyond that, there were only questions. Some people believed he had been caught years later. Others claimed that he had become the captain of another ship. A few insisted that he had disappeared with his stolen gold and was living comfortably somewhere far from the sea. I sometimes wondered about that myself. Perhaps he was sitting in another harbor, telling another group of sailors stories about distant islands and buried fortunes. Perhaps he was already planning another voyage. Or perhaps the sea had finally taken him. There was no way to know. But there was one thing I knew for certain. I would never return to Treasure Island. The thought of going back had crossed my mind more than once, especially when I remembered the treasure we had left behind. But every time the idea appeared, I remembered the dead, the betrayal, and the fear that had followed us from the beginning. Some places are better left in the past. Treasure Island was one of them. Even now, when I hear the sound of waves against the shore, I sometimes remember that cold afternoon when the old sailor first walked into our inn. I remember the heavy chest he carried, the scar across his face, and the nervous way he looked toward the road. At the time, I thought he was simply a mysterious traveler. I had no idea that he was carrying the beginning of an adventure that would change my life forever. And perhaps that is how the greatest adventures begin. Not with a grand announcement, not with a warning that danger is coming. Sometimes, they begin quietly, with an unexpected stranger walking through an ordinary door, carrying a secret that is powerful enough to change everything. For me, that secret was a map, and that map led to Treasure Island. Years have passed since the voyage to Treasure Island, yet there are certain memories that time has never been able to erase. I can still remember the cold afternoon when the old sailor first entered our inn, carrying his heavy chest and looking over his shoulder as though death itself were following him. At the time, I could not have imagined that this strange man would change my life, or that the secret he carried would lead me across the ocean in search of a fortune hidden by pirates. Looking back now, the treasure itself seems almost like a small part of the story. The gold was real, of course, and the fortune was large enough to change the lives of those who survived the journey. But the real value of the adventure was not found inside a wooden chest. It was found in everything that happened before we reached it, and in everything we learned after we returned. I had once believed that courage meant being fearless. Treasure Island taught me something different. There were many moments when I was frightened, sometimes so frightened that I wanted nothing more than to run home. Yet I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep moving when fear is telling you to stop. The old sailor had understood fear very well. He had spent his final days looking toward the road, waiting for the men who were hunting him. He knew that the past could follow a person across oceans, and that secrets could become dangerous when too many people knew about them. His fear had seemed strange to me when I first met him, but after everything that happened, I understood it. He had not been afraid of the treasure. He had been afraid of what men would do to possess it. That lesson became even clearer when I thought about Long John Silver. When I first met him aboard the Hispaniola, he seemed like one of the most pleasant men on the ship. He was friendly, clever, helpful, and always ready with a story or a joke. I trusted him because he gave me every reason to trust him. But beneath that friendly appearance was a man who could plan a mutiny, manipulate his crew, and change sides whenever it suited him. Even so, Silver was not a simple villain. He was a survivor. He understood that the sea was unforgiving, and he knew that a man who could not adapt would not survive for long. When his plans failed, he changed them. When his crew abandoned him, he made another bargain. When the treasure disappeared, he looked for another way to save himself. Perhaps that was why I could never completely hate him. He had done terrible things, but he was also intelligent enough to understand when he had lost. and he knew when it was time to disappear. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to Long John Silver after he escaped from the island. Some believed that he continued his life as a sailor, while others claimed that he eventually settled somewhere far from the sea. There were even stories that he had found another fortune. I never discovered the truth. Perhaps that is fitting. A man like Silver was never meant to have a clear ending. The island itself remained in my memory as something almost unreal. I could still picture its high hills, thick forests, hidden paths, and dark caves. From the sea, it had looked mysterious and beautiful, but once we entered its forests, I understood how dangerous it could be. The island had hidden more than treasure. It had hidden secrets, fear, and the remains of the men who had come before us. We had entered believing that the greatest danger would be finding the treasure. Instead, the greatest danger had been the people searching for it. That is something I have remembered throughout my life. People often imagine that wealth will solve their problems. They believe that if they had enough money, they would never have to worry again. But Treasure Island taught me that money can create problems just as easily as it can solve them. The pirates had not needed to become enemies. They could have shared the fortune. They could have returned home safely. But greed changed their decisions. Once they believed that the treasure belonged to them, friendship became less important, loyalty became meaningless, and human life became something they were willing to risk. In the end, the treasure belonged to almost no one. Some died before they could touch it. Others survived but lost friends. Some gained a fortune but carried memories that could not be forgotten. And one man, Long John Silver, escaped with only a small portion of what he had wanted so desperately. Perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. The men who wanted the treasure most were the ones who suffered the most because of it. I was fortunate. I returned home. I was able to see my family again, walk through the familiar streets of my village, and hear the ordinary sounds that I had once taken for granted. After spending so long surrounded by danger, those simple things became more valuable to me than gold. The harbor seemed different when I returned. The boats were still there. The fishermen still came and went. The sea still rose and fell with the tide. But I was different. Before the voyage, I had wanted adventure because I thought adventure meant excitement and discovery. After the voyage, I understood that adventure also meant uncertainty, responsibility, and sometimes fear. I had learned that the world was much larger than my village. I had learned that people were capable of surprising kindness, but also terrible betrayal. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest victory was simply making it home. The treasure itself eventually became part of our lives, but we never allowed it to become the center of them. Some of the money was used wisely, some was shared, and some was kept safely for the future. We had enough to live more comfortably, but I never wanted to become obsessed with wealth. Whenever I looked at a gold coin from the treasure, I remembered the island. I remembered the gunfire. I remembered the dark forest. I remembered the men who had fallen. And I remembered the old sailor's frightened eyes. The coin was beautiful, but the memories attached to it were much more valuable. There was another thing I learned during the voyage, something that had nothing to do with treasure or pirates. I learned that people reveal themselves through their choices. The captain remained loyal when betrayal would have been easier. The doctor remained calm when everyone else was frightened. Ben Gunn survived years of loneliness and still found a way to help us. And Long John Silver chose survival and self-interest whenever the opportunity appeared. None of them was perfect, but their choices showed who they really were. That is why I still remember the voyage so clearly. It was not simply a journey across the sea. It was a journey through fear, temptation, courage, and human nature. Sometimes, when I sit near the harbor and watch the ships disappearing beyond the horizon, I wonder whether another young sailor is somewhere out there dreaming about adventure. Perhaps he is imagining distant islands, forgotten treasures, and stories waiting to be discovered. If he is, I hope he remembers something that I learned the hard way. Adventure can be wonderful, but it can also be dangerous. Trust should be earned. Greed can destroy even the strongest friendship. And sometimes the most valuable treasure is not something that can be placed inside a chest. It is the wisdom gained from the journey, the courage to face danger, the ability to recognize true friendship, and the understanding that coming home safely can be worth more than all the gold in the world. That is what Treasure Island gave me. Not just a fortune, not just a story, but a lesson that stayed with me for the rest of my life. And whenever I think back to that mysterious sailor walking through the door of our little inn, I realize that my adventure had begun long before I ever saw the island. It began with a stranger, a wooden chest, and a secret that was hidden inside a map. And that map changed everything. Congratulations! You have just completed the story of Treasure Island. You listened to a long English story filled with mystery, adventure, danger, friendship, and hidden treasure. If you understood most of the story, that is a great achievement. And if you missed some words or sentences, don't worry. Listening to English regularly is one of the best ways to improve your understanding and confidence. Now, it is time to turn listening into speaking practice. Take a deep breath, relax, and get ready to read aloud. Try not to read too quickly. Focus on clear pronunciation, natural pauses, and confident speaking. The old sailor arrived at our small inn carrying a heavy wooden chest and a secret that would change my life forever. Before long, I discovered that he was hiding from dangerous men who were searching for a mysterious map. The map showed the location of an island where a famous pirate had buried a great treasure. Our journey across the sea seemed exciting at first, but after we discovered that some of the crew were planning a mutiny, everything changed. We had to face danger, betrayal, and fear before finally finding the treasure and making our way home. Now read this passage aloud. Read it once slowly, then read it again with more confidence. Pay attention to the pronunciation of each word, and try to sound natural rather than simply reading the sentences from the screen. When you finish, ask yourself one question: could I tell this part of the story in my own words? If the answer is yes, your English is improving. Good job! You have completed the reading practice. Now let's move on to the vocabulary challenge. You will see some words from today's story on the screen. Your task is simple. Try to understand the meaning of each word and write your answers in the comments below. Don't worry if you don't know every word. Take your time, think about the context, and make your best guess. This simple practice will help you build your vocabulary and remember new words for a longer time. Thank you for learning with me today. Keep practicing, keep reading, and keep speaking English every day. I'll see you in the next class. Until then, keep learning and keep improving.